He didn't come for applause. He didn't wear his medal to be seen. He came to bury the man who saved his life, only to be told that a shiny piece of metal didn't buy respect. In a crowded airport gate amid rolling luggage and boarding calls, one quiet man in uniform stood still, dismissed, disrespected, but never dishonored. What happened next stopped an entire airport, not because of anger, but because someone finally remembered what sacrifice truly looks like. This is not just a story about a veteran. It's about us and whether we still recognize what quiet heroism means when it stands right in front of us. Colonel Jack Whitmore stood silently at Gate 42 of Denver International Airport, blending into the orchestrated chaos of travel. Families clustered in rows of plastic chairs. Business travelers scrolled their phones. Announcements crackled overhead. He was a quiet figure in the storm. Sharp dress uniform pressed with the kind of precision that never faded from his bones even decades after combat. A folded itinerary sat neatly in the outer pocket of his carry-on. He wasn't here to make a scene. He wasn't here to be noticed. But today, he was impossible to ignore. Alyssa Kerr, a gate agent barely pushing 30, looked up as he approached. Her eyes flicked to the Medal of Honor resting against his chest. Sky blue ribbon, gold star. Her brows lifted slightly in surprise before she scoffed. "Sorry, sir. Wearing a shiny necklace doesn't mean you deserve first class." Her words cut with a smirk. Her tone was sharp, dismissive. She saw a piece of metal and made a snap judgment. She didn't see the weight it carried. Jack didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue or demand anything. He simply stepped back, his face unmoved, and reached for the phone in his coat pocket, a number stored in his contacts that he hadn't touched in years. He pressed call. 9 minutes later, everything changed. The airport, once humming with motion and chatter, seemed to hold its breath. Flights were paused, gates delayed, engines silenced. Heads turned as black SUVs rolled onto the tarmac like shadows, sleek and decisive. This wasn't a security threat. No evacuation order, no bomb squad, just the echoing response to a quiet man in uniform, denied what was rightfully his. A man who, in the eyes of a gate agent, was nothing more than a passenger with a fancy medal. But to the Pentagon, he was a name that still commanded attention. Colonel Jack Whitmore walked back through the terminal, not with drama, but with purpose. Each step was firm, deliberate. How he'd always moved, through war zones, through command, through grief. He wasn't in a rush. He wasn't trying to prove anything. The medal on his chest wasn't for display. To him, it was heavier than the ribbon or medal could ever convey. It wasn't a symbol of glory. It was a gravestone he wore every day. He was 54 years old, removed from the battlefield by time, but not by memory. The Iraq War was behind him in years, but never far from his mind. His body had scars that had faded, but his mind, his heart, still carried the deepest wounds. Tomorrow morning at 0800 hours, he would stand at Arlington National Cemetery. Not as a speaker, not for ceremony or applause. He was going to lay to rest the man who saved his life, Sergeant First Class David Rios. Jack had made a promise 18 years ago that he would live a life worthy of the sacrifice. He'd tried. He'd done his best. It still didn't feel like enough. Fallujah, Iraq, November 2006. Dust hung thick in the air, mixed with the sharp sting of cordite in blood. What began as a routine patrol near Sector 17 turned into chaos in seconds. Two IEDs detonated almost simultaneously. The shockwave flattened the alley. Then came the gunfire, coordinated, relentless, and lethal. Insurgents had set a three-line ambush. It was hell. 3 soldiers were killed in the first half-minute. Jack could still hear their voices, their laughter, their cries. He didn't remember the decision to run into that alley over and over. It wasn't courage. It was instinct. He sprinted into enemy fire 7 times, dragging injured men out of certain death. Bullets zipping past, mortars pounded the pavement around him. On his 6th run, while pulling a wounded private, he stumbled, fully exposed. And then David stepped out. Sergeant Rios didn't think twice. He left cover, unleashed a hail of suppressive fire with his saw, and became the target Jack had been. 2 bullets hit his chest, 1 tore through his thigh. He stayed standing long enough for Jack to complete the rescue. They survived, but just barely. Jack was airlifted for shrapnel wounds and sheer exhaustion. David would never walk the same again. For 12 years, he drifted in and out of VA hospitals, living in the margins between chronic pain and invisible scars. It wasn't the bullets that took him in the end. It was the PTSD. Since that day, Jack had spoken at podiums, shaken hands with presidents, been saluted by generals. But none of it meant anything if he didn't show up now, to honor the man who had made all of that possible. Back in the terminal, passengers rushed past, weaving around Jack like water splitting around a stone. He stood still, his hand reached to his chest, not to show the medal, but to find his balance, to remind himself why he was here. This flight wasn't about comfort or recognition. It wasn't about first class. It was about making sure one woman, David's widow, saw that someone still remembered, that someone still cared, that the man she lost hadn't been forgotten. Being denied that by someone who saw only a ribbon and not the reason behind it stung deeper than any shrapnel ever had. To that gate agent, the Medal of Honor didn't mean anything. But to Colonel Jack Whitmore, at this moment, it meant everything. With the polished detachment that comes from 3 long years of repeating, "I'm sorry, that's policy," hundreds of times a day, Alyssa didn't look up immediately. Her fingers danced across the keyboard in swift, practiced motions, cold and impersonal. When she finally acknowledged the man standing before her, her eyes flicked briefly to the silver medal hanging from the chain around his neck, then met his gaze without a trace of emotion. "Sir," she said, her voice flat and rehearsed, "your reservation has been flagged." Jack raised a brow, the faintest crease forming between his eyes. "Flagged? It looks like you used a military discount," Alyssa continued, her tone mechanical. "The system's asking for a fare adjustment before you can board first class." She added a shallow smile, the kind that didn't reach her eyes, and it was clear she thought the conversation was already over. Jack stayed calm, steady. "Ma'am, I paid full fare for this ticket 3 weeks ago. No discount was applied." Alyssa gave a small shrug, eyes flicking back to the screen. Her fingers resumed their rhythm. Sometimes that happens when veterans request upgrades after check-in. The system assumes it's a courtesy bump. Wordlessly, Jack reached into his bag and pulled out a paper, unfolding it with deliberate care. He placed it gently on the counter. "This is my confirmation. Full fare, first class, no discount, no upgrade." She barely looked at it. "I'm not saying it's wrong," she said, her voice now tinged with weariness. "I'm telling you what the system says. I can give you a seat in coach, or," she paused, almost annoyed, "unless you want to pay the balance now, I can't seat you in first class." Jack didn't flinch. He leaned in slightly, his voice quiet but firm. "There is no balance." But her mind was already made up. She shifted her weight onto one foot and muttered, just loud enough to sting, "Some people think a shiny medal earns them special treatment." Jack's spine straightened, not from pride, but discipline. He'd stood tall under enemy fire. He'd survived IED blasts and nights soaked in sand and blood. But this was a different kind of wound, one that came disguised as procedure, but dripped with condescension. Still, he didn't raise his voice, didn't argue. He simply placed the paper back on the counter with steady hands. "This isn't about privilege," he said, low and even. "It's about honoring a soldier who saved my life. I need to be on that flight." Alyssa didn't blink. Her mouse clicked again. "Sir, I'm just doing my job." The passengers around them were beginning to notice. A few heads turned. A man nudged his wife. In the far corner, a teenager quietly began recording the scene on his phone. No one knew who Jack Whitmore was, but they could sense something wasn't right. The air shifted, like watching a judge mock a grieving pastor at a funeral. A TSA officer approached, curiosity piqued. He stopped short when the glint of the Medal of Honor caught the overhead light. His posture softened, but he didn't intervene. Alyssa remained unbothered. "You can take coach or wait for a different flight," she repeated. "Those are your options." Jack looked past her, eyes scanning the gate. First-class passengers were lining up, stepping aboard one by one. The gate door remained open. "I'm asking you," he said once more, calm but heavy, "to review the reservation properly. But she didn't. Her finger tapped a key. With a hiss, the door to the jet bridge sealed shut. A low thud echoed as Flight 20178 began to push back from the terminal. The engines whirred to life. The wheels began to turn. Seat 2A was flying to Washington without him. Jack stood still, his arms at his side, staring through the glass as the aircraft moved away. On board, an empty seat, a schedule that wouldn't wait, a funeral that would begin tomorrow in Arlington, with or without him. Alyssa didn't look up again. She was already processing the next boarding group. Jack remained by the window, a solitary silhouette, while the aircraft disappeared into the overcast Denver sky. The chill in the terminal wasn't from the air conditioning. It came from something else. The silent, searing ache of helplessness. He hadn't felt that weight in years. Not the kind that comes from carrying a weapon through the battlefield, but the kind that festers when your service, your sacrifice, is dismissed like an inconvenience. His seat was gone. So was the flight. So was the only timely way to say goodbye to the man who had once stepped into enemy fire so that Jack could live. But Jack hadn't survived war by accepting defeat. He stepped back from the window, exhaled slowly, and unzipped his laptop bag. From inside, he pulled his phone. His thumb hovered for a moment over a contact he hadn't touched in over 2 years. General Marissa Delaney, Pentagon Chief of Staff, former battalion commander. The woman who had once pinned a Bronze Star to his uniform in the scorching heat of Iraq. The one who had knelt beside him behind sandbags as they buried 6 men in a single week. He tapped call. She answered on the second ring. "Whitmore," she said, her voice calm and sharp, just as he remembered it. "Yes, ma'am," Jack replied. "I hate to call like this, but I've just been denied boarding on a full-fare first-class ticket. The gate agent flagged it because of my military status. She wouldn't even check the documents. I'm going to miss Sergeant Rios's funeral." There was a pause on the other end, not one of uncertainty, but of calm precision, the kind that comes before a deliberate move. "Are you at the airport now?" she asked. "Denver," he replied, his voice steady. "Gate 42, Flight 2178 to Washington. They just left without me." Marissa Delaney's tone changed instantly. It turned icy. No nonsense. "You're telling me a Medal of Honor recipient was denied a paid seat to attend a funeral at Arlington?" "Yes, ma'am." "Understood. Stay where you are. This is about to be resolved." She didn't say goodbye. She didn't need to. Jack Whitmore slowly slid his phone back into the pouch on his chest and turned to face the gate area. The people nearby, passengers who had witnessed the earlier confrontation, watched him with new eyes. Something in the air had shifted. The glances they cast toward him weren't casual anymore. The Medal of Honor that hung around his neck was no longer just a medal. It had become a silent protest, a symbol that something deeply wrong had occurred. 9 minutes passed. Suddenly, the usual background hum of airport life, the repetitive boarding announcements, the chatter, the clinking of luggage wheels, cut out. Every monitor in the terminal blinked. The flight schedules froze, then changed in perfect unison. A message replaced the departure board data. All aircraft movement temporarily suspended by federal order. Remain in terminal until further notice. A ripple of confusion ran through the crowd. A woman clutched her boarding pass as if gripping it tighter would make sense of what was happening. Children stopped squirming. Flight attendants exchanged nervous glances, brows furrowing. A TSA agent rushed toward the gate counter, urgency etched in his stride, followed closely by 2 men in dark suits flashing federal credentials. One of them wore an earpiece. He didn't speak a word. He tapped the radio on his shoulder, gave a firm nod toward the tarmac, and stepped aside. Then came the SUVs. Through the expansive airport windows, sleek black government vehicles swarmed the tarmacs in perfect formation. Their emergency lights flashed but made no sound. There was no sense of crisis, just precise, controlled authority. Inside one of the vehicles, a screen streamed live footage. It showed General Marissa Delaney inside a Pentagon operations room, standing tall in front of a panel of FAA officials and senior personnel. "This isn't about protocol," she said calmly, her voice slicing through the tension. "This is about precedent. If a Medal of Honor recipient, en route to lay a brother in arms to rest at Arlington, is turned away because of a flawed system, then that system must stop, right now." There was no rebuttal. The order was given. The screen went black. Back in Denver, the entire terminal had fallen into a stunned silence. People were no longer just sitting, they were standing. Phones were lowered, hands frozen mid-text. No one was sure what they were witnessing, but everyone understood something was happening, something much larger than a missed flight. At the center of it stood Jack, silent, still, not demanding attention, not speaking, just present, straight-backed, uniform crisp, his Medal of Honor glinting under the fluorescent lights. His eyes weren't fixed on anything. He hadn't asked for any of this, but sometimes dignity isn't loud. It doesn't march or shout. Sometimes it stands quietly until someone in power finally remembers what honor truly means. And today, General Delaney remembered. The scene at Gate 42 had changed from an ordinary boarding mishap to something that felt historical. People gathered in clusters, whispering theories, glancing from the halted monitors to the silent soldier. Some suspected it was a drill. Others feared a national crisis. But no alarms were sounding, and there was no evacuation. Only that growing sense that they were watching something significant unfold in real time. Then the men in black returned. Two agents in DHS tactical suits moved with unmistakable certainty. Their badges were the only identifiers, but their presence alone commanded attention. They strode straight to the gate counter, parting the crowd like water. Alyssa Kerr was still typing at the desk, unaware of the whirlwind behind her. She looked up only when the older agent, a silver-haired woman with eyes sharp as razors, spoke. "Miss Alyssa Kerr?" the agent said evenly. Alyssa frowned. "Yes?" "Agent Rebecca Martinez, DHS." She held up her badge. "We need to speak with you immediately regarding your interaction with Colonel Jack Whitmore." The confidence Alyssa had perfected over years of corporate training cracked. She glanced nervously at her supervisor's vacant office. I was just following airline policy," she stammered. The second agent, a younger man already holding a tablet, tapped the screen and replied, "We've reviewed the gate activity logs and the surveillance footage. Your statement does not match the data." A hush spread through the terminal. Phones were raised now, not in confusion, but to capture the moment. A man in the back whispered, "That's the lady who kicked out the veteran." Another added, "That's the guy with the Medal of Honor." The murmurs grew. Within minutes, that phrase would turn into a trending hashtag. And Jack, he stood a few feet back, still silent. He didn't wear a smile. He didn't show triumph. His expression was calm, solemn, like a man watching the inevitable collapse of something that had been cracking for far too long. The airline manager finally arrived, out of breath and red-faced, phone clutched to his ear. He had the panicked energy of someone who had just answered a furious call from corporate. "What the hell happened, Colonel Whitmore?" he gasped. "Sir," Jack turned slowly to face the manager. His voice, low and steady, carried the weight of truth. "It wasn't a misunderstanding," and he said. "It was a judgment." The manager stiffened, clearly thrown off balance. "Of course. Yes, sir, we're deeply sorry for the treatment you received," he said quickly. "We've reinstated your original reservation, and we'd like to offer you complimentary first-class service for a life." A low murmur swept through the watching crowd. Phones were still out, still recording, but Jack didn't even blink. "I didn't come here looking for perks," he replied without hesitation. "I came here to bury the man who saved my life, and now I'm late." The manager swallowed hard, realizing no offer could fix what had already been broken. "Understood, sir. Please know we've launched an internal investigation. Miss Kerr has been suspended pending review." But that wouldn't be enough, not now. Because what followed was no longer just a matter of policy, it became a moment of national reflection. By 7 p.m., footage of the incident had flooded every major social media platform. A 19-second video showing Alyssa's smug expression and her dismissive words, "Shiny medals don't mean first class," had already surpassed 3 million views. Hashtags like hashtag shiny medals, hashtag honor denied, and #gate 42 began trending across platforms within the hour. Veteran organizations across the country began reposting the video, calling for accountability not just for Alyssa Kerr, but for the broader culture of quiet disrespect shown toward those who served when no cameras were watching. Some comments came from a place of empathy. "That man wore the Medal of Honor. You don't need to know his name. You just salute. Others were filled with righteous anger. This is what happens when we train people in customer service, but not in common decency. Not every reaction was kind. A few voices accused Jack of pulling rank. Others thought the airline's response was too extreme, but those opinions were drowned out by an overwhelming chorus of voices that understood this wasn't about seats or status. This was about what kind of nation we choose to be. By midnight, the airline issued an official public statement. We deeply regret the unacceptable treatment of Colonel Jack Whitmore at Gate 42. We have issued a formal apology and are implementing mandatory training for all frontline staff, focused on veteran awareness and respectful conduct toward those who have served. It was a start, but no carefully worded release could erase what had happened in that terminal. Less than an hour after the agents arrived, Alyssa was escorted from the premises. No angry mobs, no applause, just a cardboard box filled with her belongings and a long, silent walk through a hallway lined with strangers who now recognized her from the video on their phones. Her only defense, "I was just doing my job," fell flat. The footage, the receipts, and the public reaction told a different story. She hadn't just enforced a rule, she had made a decision about someone's worth. And now, the public was making their own decision about hers. As the story gained momentum, news outlets began reaching out to Jack for comment. He refused them all. When the airline followed up, asking if he would reconsider the lifetime benefit they had offered, Jack answered plainly, "The only seat that matters to me is in the one I was trying to sit in today. I don't need compensation. I need a country that remembers what this medal means." He boarded the reinstated flight quietly. A few passengers, humbled, offered soft words of thanks or a respectful nod. Jack simply nodded back. He said nothing as he walked past the gate, but the people who watched him walk away wouldn't forget. They had just witnessed a man who could have demanded everything, choose instead to ask for nothing but dignity. He hadn't come to be a symbol, but now, whether he wanted it or not, he had become one. The plane touched down at Reagan National Airport just after midnight. No one clapped, no welcoming committee, just quiet reverence. On the tarmac, unmarked military SUVs waited at a distance, flanking the aircraft in silent escort all the way from Denver. Seat 2A no longer held just another passenger. It carried something weightier, an invisible burden of sacrifice and memory. Colonel Jack Whitmore stepped off the plane without a word, his duffel bag slung over one shoulder, service cap held gently in one hand. The Medal of Honor resting around his neck caught the faint terminal light, casting a fleeting shimmer on the polished floor as he walked through the still, pre-dawn quiet. By the time the sun broke the horizon, pouring golden light across the Potomac River, Jack was alone in the Section 60 of Arlington National Cemetery. He had stood here before, for comrades, for brothers, for too many. But today was different. Today was for David Rios, the man who took 3 bullets in Fallujah so Jack could live. David had been more than a squad leader. He had been Jack's anchor in a world unraveling, the kind of man who didn't care for recognition, who didn't chase medals. He followed orders without question, always keeping his men alive. But he didn't make it home. After Iraq, David fought battles no one televised. Insomnia, pain that never faded, paperwork that got lost more often than it got processed. The last time the VA misplaced his claim, David had looked Jack in the eyes and whispered, "I think I'm fighting the wrong war now." Jack had promised him, "You won't fight it alone." Now, 18 years later, he had kept that promise, just not in the way he'd hoped. David lay beneath the earth he had fought for, beneath the silence of a nation that was still learning how to honor its own. Jack stood still, cap in hand, eyes closed. No speeches, no news crews. Just a soldier standing for a friend who once stood for him. And in that quiet, long before the city stirred, the weight of sacrifice settled like the dawn itself. Quiet, resolute, and unforgettable. The honors were precise, solemn. A flag-draped casket rested at the center of the ceremony, surrounded by the silent ache of loss and the unspoken reverence of those who stood witness. An honor guard moved in practice formation, every movement sharp, deliberate, flawless. The rifles cracked in sequence, echoing across the quiet hills, And then a single bugle carried the mournful notes of taps into the soft wind. That wind, gentle yet steady, swept through the gathered crowd as if to remind them that time moves forward, even in grief. Colonel Jack Whitmore stood among them, immovable in his dress blues, shoulders squared, eyes forward, disciplined even in sorrow. He did not flinch as the last note faded. His face remained unreadable, the years of command etched in quiet resolve. But inside, memory surged like a tide. Faces, voices, promises, none louder than the one that had brought him here today. As mourners stepped forward to offer their goodbyes, David's widow, Elena, approached him. Her eyes were rimmed red from tears long held back, yet her voice carried the strength of someone who had spent years keeping her family together through every deployment and every homecoming. She extended a tightly folded flag toward him. "Colonel Whitmore," she said with quiet grace, "he always said you were the reason he lived as long as he did." Jack took the flag with hands that trembled, not from age or weakness, but from the weight of memory pressing down on them. His voice was soft, not broken, but deeply reverent. "I didn't save him," Jack said. "He saved me. He gave me 20 more years of life. A seat on a plane. That was the least I could fight for." Elena nodded. There was nothing else to say. Words wouldn't have carried what she understood in that moment. Behind her stood David's 3 children, all dressed in black, eyes fixed on Jack, searching his face as if looking for something their father left behind. The youngest, a boy of no more than 10, stepped forward and raised a small, solemn salute. Jack returned it without hesitation, his eyes misting over. Later, as the crowd slowly dispersed and the groundskeepers began their quiet work of restoring order to grief, Jack remained behind. He walked to the fresh grave, dropped to one knee, and removed his cap. He held it respectfully on his lap. "I kept my promise, brother," he whispered. "I made it." The wind stirred the trees above, as if whispering back. As he stood and turned to leave, Jack's thoughts didn't dwell on the confrontation at the airport gate, but drifted instead toward a larger, more sobering truth. How many others had been turned away in silence over the years? Veterans with medals tucked into drawers, their honors forgotten or ignored. Widows dismissed with bureaucratic excuses. Men and women who had stepped forward for their country only to return to a system dressed in red tape and polite indifference. He never wanted to become a symbol, never sought to be the face of protest. But maybe, just maybe, what happened at that airport terminal could spark something real, something that wouldn't fade with the news cycle. At the edge of the cemetery, near the hum of distant traffic, a reporter waited quietly. No camera in his face, no microphone shoved forward, just presence, respectful. Jack turned to him once, his voice calm, steady. "Make sure they understand," he said. "Service isn't about privilege. It's about sacrifice. And that doesn't end just because the one does." With that, he turned toward a waiting car. Not a limousine, not a military escort, just a black sedan, discreet and unmarked, sent by an old friend from the Pentagon. A gesture of gratitude without flash, just like Jack would have wanted it. As the car pulled away, Jack gazed out the window at the rows upon rows of white headstones. Each stone a life, each life a story. And for one day, maybe longer, the country had remembered what those names truly meant. The question still hung in the air. Why do veterans, especially the decorated ones, still face such indifference? Even after the uniform is neatly folded, after the final note of the bugle fades, and long after the headlines disappear, this question remains unanswered. What happened to Colonel Jack Whitmore at Gate 42 wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was a mirror held up to a painful reality. Despite all the flags flown, speeches made, and holidays marked, the divide between military and civilian America continues to grow. Most Americans have never worn a uniform. Fewer than 7% of living citizens are veterans, and among them, even fewer wear signs of their service on the outside. Many keep their stories to themselves, not because they're ashamed, but because they've learned not to expect recognition, and they certainly never ask for it. That quiet humility, while admirable, is also what makes them invisible. In Jack's case, his medals, earned in sacrifice, were dismissed with a sneer. Medals don't buy first class. It wasn't just a cruel remark. It was a symptom of a deeper indifference, one that veterans face not just in airports, but across the entire system. From VA hospitals to job interviews, from housing forms to funeral paperwork. Even saying goodbye to a fallen comrade can mean hours of calls, delays, misfiled documents. Thank you for your service is spoken often, but too often that's where it ends. No follow-through, no real support. It becomes an empty phrase, polite, automatic, and meaningless when followed by endless bureaucracy. There's a heavy emotional cost in being thanked by a system that later puts your call on hold for 6 hours when you're trying to refill medication, or tells you your claim will take another 18 months, or sends you to 3 different offices to get funeral arrangements approved for a brother who gave everything. Veterans know how to endure, but they shouldn't have to endure being forgotten. And there's more than just institutional neglect. It's cultural, not rooted in cruelty, but in distance. For many civilians, military service is an abstract idea. Sacrifice is something seen in movies, not lived. Memorial Day becomes a long weekend instead of a solemn remembrance. So when someone like Jack wears a Medal of Honor in public, he's met not with respect, but with suspicion, or worse, apathy. It's easier for some to believe that veterans want special treatment than to recognize they have already earned it, many times over. And so these men and women are forced to prove themselves again and again, long after their uniforms should have said everything. Still in the shadows of all that neglect, moments of true honor emerge. Quiet gestures, silent respect. A black sedan sent without ceremony. A salute from a child. A promise kept at a graveside. Sometimes that's what keeps the legacy alive. Like the honor flights that bring aging veterans to Washington, D.C. to see the memorials built in their name, sometimes for the very first time, there are moments that stir the soul. In classrooms, children learn the meaning of service. At parades, they salute with tiny hands raised high. Strangers in diners quietly pick up the check for a man wearing a faded cap, nodding in silent respect. These gestures are beautiful. They matter. But let's not mistake them for enough. These acts, however well-meaning, are not replacements for real, sustained, systemic respect. It isn't just about offering a free flight or painting a parking spot reserved for veterans. It's about something far deeper. It's about listening, truly listening, when a veteran says, "I need help." It's about believing them when they speak of the wounds we cannot see, the battles they continue to fight long after the gunfire has gone silent. It's about standing by their side, not just during combat, but when they're caught in the exhausting maze of bureaucracy and indifference back home. Colonel Jack Whitmore never asked for special treatment. He never expected applause or recognition. What he wanted was simple: dignity, the chance to honor a fallen brother in arms. And when that right was denied to him, not with malice, but with cold, thoughtless dismissal, he didn't lash out. He didn't yell. He didn't curse or shove. He simply stood his ground. Not out of anger, but out of resolve. That's what made people take notice. Because sometimes the truest form of honor is the quietest one. It doesn't come wrapped in noise or spectacle. It doesn't demand attention. But when that honor is ignored, when we act as if a soldier's sacrifice ends the day they're discharged, then we reveal something broken in ourselves and in the nation they served. Veterans are not props to dust off for parades. They're not just stories to be told on designated holidays. They are real people, men and women, who once carried this nation when it was too wounded, too weak, too uncertain to carry itself. And in return, they deserve more than scripted apologies and recycled promises. They deserve to be seen, fully, clearly, while they are still here to feel it. Jack Whitmore never raised his voice, but in the stillness of his presence, in the way he stood at that gate, calm, composed, clearly humiliated but entirely unbroken, he said everything. His silence carried weight. His restraint spoke volumes. And in that moment, he became something more than a man with medals. He became a symbol, a quiet, powerful reminder that dignity doesn't shout. But when it's ignored, it reveals the cracks in everything we claim to value. People remembered that image. Jack, standing there, denied a seat because someone in a suit didn't recognize what those ribbons on his chest meant. They remembered how the terminal, bustling just moments before, slowed to stillness as people began to understand. They remembered how one man's quiet courage held up a mirror to a busy crowd, and for a rare moment, they looked. But this story was never just about Jack. It's about all of us. Would you have spoken up? Would you have stepped forward when the man in uniform was told, medals don't mean you get first class? Or would you have kept your head down, eyes fixed on your phone, hoping someone else would do the right thing? These moments, small as they may seem, are not just passing encounters. They are reflections. They show us how we treat those who've borne the weight of our freedoms. And if we're honest, too often we let those moments pass us by without a word. We can do better. We must do better. So now it's your turn. Let's bring this conversation into our homes, our hearts, and our communities. Have you ever witnessed someone in uniform being brushed aside or quietly honored in a way that left you speechless? Have we grown too accustomed to the comfort their sacrifice bought us? Too quick to forget who paid the price? What does real respect look like in today's America? Are we giving it to the ones who earned it? Not with speeches, but with blood, sweat, and years of their lives. We want to hear from you. Whether it's a moment from your own service, the story of a loved one, or a simple encounter in a waiting room or a checkout line, share it in the comments. Your voice matters. And if you stayed with us until the end of this story, thank you. Thank you for choosing to give your time to something that doesn't trend, but should. Thank you for caring enough to think about the difference between silence and earned respect. Thank you for remembering. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who believes that respect is not old-fashioned. It's long overdue. Because the next time someone like Jack is asked to step aside, maybe someone else will step forward. Maybe someone will remember this moment, and that's how honor lives on.